Thank you very much for that overly long introduction. I'd like to thank Anna Falbel, Ugo Segawa, and the entire team here for the invitation to come back here 2 years later to speak at FAUUSP. If I could have the lights down, please, so you can see. Hopefully this won't blow up. Thank you. In the southern Andes, during the late 17th and 18th centuries, when the Spanish crown was slowly losing its grip on the Americas, and Amerindian groups began organizing into activist and increasingly violent political groups, a style of architectural sculpture emerged that remains one of the most vigorous and original outcomes of the meeting of two cultures. Known most commonly as estilo mestizo or arquitectura mestiza, this flourishing school of architectural carving is distinguished by its virtuoso combination of European late Renaissance and Baroque forms with Andean sacred and profane symbolism. In a recent book, I named this style the Andean hybrid Baroque to avoid the more overtly racial connotations of the term mestizo, a person of mixed race, because even though the botanical term hybrid has also at times taken on racist overtones, particularly in the 19th century, it is now widely accepted by anthropologists and sociologists as a neutral hermeneutical tool for interpreting the cultural dimensions of globalization. And indeed, like all labels, it is problematic. It would be difficult to exaggerate the stranglehold the debate over the idea of mestizo or combination Andean-European style has had over the historiography of the colonial art of present-day Peru and Bolivia in particular. For over 80 years, the leading scholars in the field passionately disputed its origin and meaning, and its legitimacy as a school of architecture. The implications of this debate touched upon a fundamental question for the field as a whole. Can one speak of indigenous content in the architecture of colonial Latin America after the first decades of the conquest? Or was it primarily an altered and debased European transplant? Those in the former camp used the term mestizo to parallel the interracial blending of colonial society and generally saw it as specific to a particular region and ethnic group. Those in the latter camp believed that the style was part of a universal phenomenon in which artists from Bulgaria to Borneo misunderstood Western European models, and they applied to it pejorative terms such as popular art and folk art. While most scholars today have moved beyond this debate and now recognize the immense indigenous impact on the arts throughout colonial Latin America, the mestizo style remains a tendentious and unresolved subject. The widespread interest in architectural hybridity in Latin America developed in tandem with 20th century Latin American nationalism and a colonial revival movement in architecture known as the colonial Renaissance, or the Renacimiento Colonial, that swept South America from the 1920s to the 1950s. The movement was championed as a homegrown alternative to international modernism, satisfying nationalist sentiments by returning to America's indigenous and colonial roots. The colonial Renaissance was especially prominent in Peru and in Argentina, where grandiose buildings such as Ricardo Malachowski's Palacio Municipal in Lima, 1929, the neo-Andean hybrid Baroque Teatro Municipal that you see there on Paseo Mercaderes in Arequipa from 1940, and Estanislao Pirovano's La Nación building on Calle Florida in Buenos Aires in the 1920s. These buildings combine Baroque ornamentation with the cold monumentality of fascist Europe. Many of the scholars who first theorized about the so-called mestizo style were directly involved in these projects, most notably Peruvian Emilio Artere, one of the masterminds of the remodeling of the Plaza de Armas in Lima in 1945, Alfredo Benavides Rodriguez, Chile's leading colonial revival architect, and the Argentines Martín Noel and Ángel Guido, the latter responsible for the renovations of the colonial centers of Salta, Tucumán, and Luján. Guido maintained that the future of American architecture lay in a return to its indigenous and colonial past, and to a harmonious interaction with landscape. Guido found an ideal combination of all three elements in his beloved mestizo style, is the term that he coined. It is with Guido, whose home you see there in the Argentine city of Rosario, which was built in a Neo-Andean hybrid Baroque style. It is with Guido that the historiography of the mestizo style begins. After toying with terms such as fusión hispano-americana aborigen in his first publication in 1925, Guido eventually settled on estilo mestizo in his theoretical manifesto Redescubrimiento de América en el Arte in 1940, Rediscovery of America in Art. In his patriotic vision of Latin American art, Guido divided his topic into four cycles of conquest and reconquest, of dictatorship and freedom. During what he called the first European conquest of art of the 16th and 17th centuries, indigenous artistic traditions were, as he put it, dictatorially suppressed by those of Spain. In what he called the first American reconquest of art in the 18th century, he saw American motifs and structures resurfacing throughout Latin America, and he saw that Amerindian art, Native American art, even exerted its influence on Europe, as very famously with the sacristy of the Cartuja of Granada, which you see there, which Guido put placing the horse before the cart as the purest Mexican mestizo style. These are his words and not mine. These two cycles then repeated themselves with the so-called second European conquest of art, the early Republican era through the early 20th century, and the second American reconquest of art, or 20th century Latin American art and architecture, primarily architecture. Guido characterized the resurgence of Amerindian culture, Native American culture, in the so-called mestizo style as an aesthetic rebellion that paralleled political revolutions like the Great Andean Rebellion of 1780 to 81, even equating the sculptors of the Andean hybrid Baroque doorways with Tupac Amaru's warriors. But Guido does not explain how these long suppressed artistic voices survived 2 centuries of conquest, a problem that would vex later generations. The Amerindian and mestizo artists' innate association with the land, again this issue of landscape, is at the core of what Guido called the voluntad de forma criolla, or Creole will to form, in a nod to Alvar Riegel's Kunstwollen. Guido recognized the style's hybridity not only in its indigenous symbolism and native flora and fauna, but also in the very structure of Andean hybrid Baroque buildings, notably their flat and mosaic-like surfaces, which he derived from pre-Hispanic buildings such as the Gate of the Sun at Tiwanaku, shown above, a prototype cited by scholars later on, owing to its uncanny similarities to facades such as this detail from the Compañía in Arequipa, the Jesuit church in Arequipa in southern Peru. Guido fine-tuned his theories in 1956 in a denser and more Wolflinian study, subjecting individual Andean hybrid Baroque monuments to polar opposite criteria, which he named continencia and incontinencia, that's restraint and lack of restraint. It is also more patriotic, this book, reflecting the jingoism of the Peronist era and the military coup that followed it. In fact, at that very moment, Guido was completing the gargantuan national monument to the flag in Rosario, finished in 1957, which you see above, which Ramon Gutierrez has aptly compared to the architecture of Albert Speer. Guido now claimed the discovery of the mestizo style and even the beginning of the colonial renaissance for Argentina. As he wrote, "It is very satisfying for Argentine art historiography to claim to be the first. to discover this transcendental art. Martín Noel, Guido's cohort and another key architect in Argentina's Restauración Nacionalista, wrote a preface to Guido's 1925 manifesto in a less scholarly style, more given to patriotic bombast. Sharing Guido's fondness for neologisms, he introduced a panoply of terms ranging from arte indo-criollo, indo-barroco, indo-hispánica, and indígena barroco, to indo-mudeja, and even indo-plateresca, exacerbating what had already become a terminological quagmire. Noel also introduced the idea that Andean hybrid Baroque was the American equivalent to mudejar, the mixture of Islamic and Christian styles characteristic of medieval Andalusia. He wrote, that mudejarismo that inspired the most beautiful pages in the architecture of Granada is in Arequipa the Indianismo that determines the origin of Hispano-Andean forms. The question of origin was the first bone of contention as scholars around the world reacted to the Guido Noel canon. Beginning with the Chilean architect Alfredo Benavides Rodriguez in 1941. Although Benavides agreed about the non-European origin of many Andean hybrid Baroque motifs, he sought increasingly distant sources. Inspired by a comment made by the Italian fascist painter Giulio Aristide Sartorio, Benavides traced many Andean hybrid Baroque features to Hindu and Buddhist sources, that is, from Indian, not Amerindian tradition. In rhetoric that echoes both 17th and 20th century racial theories, Benavides maintains that mestizo artists, as he called them, were attracted to Asian models because of their racial origins in Asia. He was not deterred by the minor detail that Amerindians crossed the Bering Straits landmass 10 to 60,000 years before Hinduism, not to mention China or Japan. Ricardo Mariátegui Oliva was the first Peruvian to publish monographs on the Baroque churches of southern Peru. Although his rhetoric was less jingoistic than that of his Argentine colleagues, he tried to claim Peruvian patrimony for Peruvian scholars. He wrote, as patriotism demands of those of us who proudly call ourselves Peruvians. In works such as his 1942 study of the Church of Santiago in Pomata, which is here, Mariátegui was careful to steer clear of Guidoan terminology and largely avoided questions about the style's origins. Nevertheless, he acknowledged the profound Amerindian influence on the buildings, and while he accepted Benavides' Asian link, he saw the influences coming from trade items, not from racial determinism. Mariátegui's most noteworthy contribution is his systematic use of archival sources. He was one of the few to do so before the late 1970s. The next scholar to join the fray was the Argentine Maria Jose Buchatzo, a 1944 volume entitled Arquitetura Colonial, a survey of monuments from California to Argentina. His conception of the Andean hybrid Baroque as a fusion of indigenous and Spanish elements concurred with those of Guido and Noel, and he accepted Benavides' Asian theories. However, he was particularly intrigued by the Amazonian origins of much of the flora and fauna on the buildings. They did not come, a lot of them did not come from the Altiplano, from the highlands. Buchatzo suggested that Jesuit missionaries imported these foreign motifs to Arequipa and the Altiplano with handicrafts that had been made in their lowland missions in Mojos Chiquitos or in the Chaco. I have since suggested that it is more likely the Jesuits brought actual specimens of lowland flora and fauna, such as this pygmy marmoset brought to the Jesuit mission headquarters for all of South America in the town of Culi in Peru. Modernist scholar Alfred Neumeyer was the first to debunk the whole idea of indigenous content in Andean Baroque architecture in 1948. proposing that it was part of a universal phenomenon in which European models underwent similar processes of provincialization from Gandhara to Scotland. But Neumayer repeatedly contradicts himself because he is not ready to give up the idea of indigenous symbolic models. As he wrote, colonial art has here returned to the original principles of native decoration through the extensive use of native motifs. In the first book-length treatment of Peruvian colonial art in English, written in 1949, Harold Wethy, who later became a Titian expert, summarized his predecessor's theories without picking favorites. This became confusing at times. Although he used the term mestizo style, he remarked that it exists all over Latin America and cannot be regarded solely as Peruvian. He even echoed Neumayer by linking the style to a universal, what he called natural primitivism, which he tied to what he called the naivete of the Indian. Yet he acknowledged pre-Hispanic prototypes, mentioning Tiahuanaco, the Nazca, and Inca textiles, also colonial era Inca textiles. In fact, this was the first mention of the influence of Andean textiles on Andean Hyder-Baroque ornament, a source I have found particularly convincing. Wethy made two especially important observations. He blamed scholars' ignorance about the origins and meaning of Andean Hyder-Baroque on a lack of archival research, and he was the first to observe that Andean Hyder-Baroque was a school of sculpture more than one of architecture, writing that it applies solely to the ornamental carving, generally in stone, on the interiors and exteriors of churches. Beginning in 1958, Yale art historian George Kubler went further than Neumayer in denying indigenous content in Andean Baroque. He dismissed the term mestizo style as racist and wrote that it was preferable to discuss the style in question as provincial highland architecture, in which the flat pattern and prolixity characteristic of provincial design everywhere in the world became dominant, in his words. By denying the Amerindian hand and insisting on terms such as provincial art and folk art, Kubler's interpretation of the Andean Hyder-Baroque comes across as derogatory, whether he meant it that way or not. And I don't think he did. Kubler's stubborn belief in an almost total extinction of Amerindian content in the arts of colonial Americas unleashed a backlash against this scholarship of Amerindian contributions to colonial culture as a whole. Reaction was very swift from Emilio Harteret from Peru. In a 1961 letter that still exists in Harvard's archives in typed form to Graziano Gasparini, who was a 21-year-old Italian emigre living in Venezuela and Kubler's most vocal disciple, Harteret formally responded to Kubler's remarks, first by disputing Kubler's ability as an Anglo-Saxon to understand the concept of mestizaje, a chauvinistic barb that mars the Peruvian architect's otherwise mostly reasonable arguments. He also believed firmly in the pre-Hispanic origins of some of its motifs, most famously what he called the figuras parlantes, or speaking figures, talking figures, the profile masks like the one you see here, which appear on the lateral borders of many Andean Hyder-Baroque doorways, which he related to Paracas and Moche culture. Nevertheless, Harteret was quick to distance himself from the racial determinism of his colleagues and the idea of an Amerindian Kunstwolle, and he later treated the mestizo style as more of a pan-Latin American phenomenon. If Harteret believed that his defense of what he called a mestizo style as a metaphor would be the last word on the subject, he was mistaken. What ensued was a prolific and enduring polemic about the origins and meaning of the Andean Hyder-Baroque that divided scholars into what were dubbed by Guido as indigenous, indigenistas, by which he meant Carteret and his colleagues, and Hispanists, which referred to the Kubler School, and to Gasparini. And this division paralyzed the field until the 1980s. This debate paralleled and intersected with a dispute over indigenous content in the architecture of early colonial New Spain, that's to say Mexico. This style is often referred to, or has been referred to by scholars of New Spanish architecture as tejic, which is a Nahuatl word for vassal. And this word was coined for architectural history in 1946, but the argument over tejic and over its legitimacy really came to a head in the 1970s. Going back to Peru, scholars in the Hispanist school tended to adopt a defensive tone when discrediting the scholars they also called indigenistas, so they ended up sharing Guido's language. One standout figure of the work of the Hispanists is their disrespect for archival documentation, a source of information which they did not merely avoid, but to which they were ideologically opposed. Gasparini, director of the Centro de Investigaciones Históricas y Estéticas in Caracas, officially opened the debate in the first issue of its Boletino in 1964. He sent out a petition to 12 leading art historians and architects, asking whether or not the term mestizo style was appropriate. Out of 12 correspondents, only 2, Kubler and the Mexican scholar Ricardo de Obina, replied in the negative. Although the Boletino contains more than 20 contributions to the discussion by the leading lights in the field over the course of more than a decade, it only succeeded in galvanizing the partisan nature of the debate. The protagonists of the so-called indigenous camp included Carteret, Teresa Gisbert, Jose de Mesa, Leopoldo Castedo, Ramon Gutierrez, and Damian Bayona, while Kubler's and Gasparini's so-called Hispanist camp included Ilmar Lux, Erwin Walter Palm, Antonio Bonet Correa, Yves Bottineau, and Robert Smith. Gasparini was the most fervent Hispanist, and I use these terms because they use them, not because I'm using them. Gasparini dismissed not only the idea of indigenous content and the term mestizo as a term for architecture, but also the very work of his predecessors, on the basis that the style was not an architectural one, i.e., not one dealing with spatial relationships, but decoration. Gasparini claimed that scholars had missed the point altogether by focusing on motifs instead of architecture, and even attacked their use of archival documents, which he called a fetishistic dependence upon objective facts. However, Gasparini's spatial understanding of architecture, developed with Borromini or Guarini in mind, is not very effective in Spanish America. Unlike in Brazil and Minas Gerais, we do have buildings with circular or at least curving plans and elevations. But in Spanish America, buildings usually have rectilinear plans and flat walls, such as here in the now cathedral in Puno, San Carlos Borromeo. More significantly, Gasparini used his spatial theories to demote the Andean hybrid Baroque style from being a school of architecture to a merely provincial or folk decorative phenomenon, echoing Kubler, but taking a different tack. Gasparini also insisted that Andean hybrid Baroque motifs derived from late classical and medieval sources, owing to very similar ways in which they altered classical Greco-Roman models. But he never explained how Byzantine or Syriac motifs made their way to 18th century South America. Consequently, when his pupil Ilmar Lux attempted a demonstration of ancient and medieval European prototypes, it backfired. The resulting 1973 monograph, excellent source, by the way, on visual documentation, ended up with far more convincing models from Renaissance and Baroque manuals than anything from Lombard or Syriac carvings. The so-called indigenous group was led by Bolivian scholars José de Mesa and Teresa Gispert, who firmly and eloquently defended the indigenous contributions to the style and to the name mestizo style, which Teresa Gispert continues to use, saying that it came from a distinct point of view that responds completely to indigenous sensibility, and that it therefore should not be disparaged with names such as primitive, popular, or provincial. They acknowledged that Andean churches did not belong spatially to the Baroque. She wrote, "There is little interest in space, above all interior space," end quote. But they were firmly opposed to Gasparini's contention that they did not constitute a school of architecture. Like Weppi, Mesa and Gispert linked indigenous motifs primarily to colonial textiles. They called them probably the principal transmitter of mestizo motifs. Perhaps Mesa and Gispert's most significant contribution is the idea that even if an individual motif, such as a mermaid, which you see up there, they're very common around Lake Titicaca, even if a motif like a mermaid was of European origin, it could take on alternative bilingual meanings derived from Andean traditions. And these could be gleaned from written sources, from oral histories, from paintings, from textiles, and from other sources. They wrote, "Every detail, with few exceptions, can be traced to an engraved source. Nevertheless, only literary texts speak to us of the chosen form's undercurrent of meaning." End of quote. This interpretation, which allowed a richer, more contextual understanding of hybrid Andean Baroque ornamentation, liberated the field from the straitjacket imposed upon it by scholars who used European sources as proof of the elimination of indigenous culture. The field's partisan stalemate was loosened most decisively by Argentine architectural historian Ramon Gutierrez, who completed a massive and deliberately anti-polemical collaborative survey in 1978, chastising Gasparini and his followers for, and I quote, "continuing the polemics over interpretations of imperfectly known objects," end quote. Gutierrez's own archival investigations were able deeply to nuance our understanding of the Andean Baroque, confirming in particular the importance of indigenous itinerant labor groups in the construction of Andean churches. These were often family groups. The corporate organization of these laborers, and also many of their names for the first time came to light from the document, so that these indigenous artists were retrieved from anonymity. Much work has followed in the past 30 years, although Gutierrez's call to return to the archives has largely gone unheeded. Peruvian art historians such as Luis Enrique Tor, Francisco Stagni, Antonio San Cristobal, and the Japanese art historian Hiroshige Okada have nevertheless vastly widened the geographic and temporal range of buildings under consideration, and have greatly enhanced our understanding of their socioeconomic context, their relationship with other media, and the multiple meanings of their imagery and structural forms. Of these, perhaps Okada is the most notable, agreeing in essence with Gispert's notion of bilingualism. He nevertheless warned against neglecting the European meaning of visual models, things like the monkey, parrot, such as this toucan, and the siren, the mermaid. But he then demonstrates how these same images were subverted by the very Native Americans whose world they were meant to represent, particularly by the indigenous elite. He wrote, "So-called mestizo motifs are in essence neither simply European nor simply Andean. They form a particular category of iconography that obtain new meanings and functions through intercultural context in the colonial period." End of quote. Okada labels the process by which Andeans co-opt European imagery of the exotic to represent themselves as inverted exoticism. I love that term, it's very descriptive. In conclusion, I would like to suggest how the field might move forward. In contrast to trends in church and social history, an increasing divide separates English language and Latin American approaches to architectural history of Latin America. The most obvious difference is one of geographic scope. Most US, UK, and Canadian scholars concentrate on New Spain and Cusco, not even much beyond Cusco. The other difference is one of methodology and subject. US, UK, and Canadian scholars prioritize subjects that favor an anthropological and post-colonial approach. I am guilty of that myself. Notably works that reflect indigenous culture. Yet there remain few efforts to support such claims or such ideas with documentary evidence. We need to expand our scope, to plumb the incalculable number of documents and buildings still awaiting us from Chiloé to Chihuahua, such as these unpublished churches in the Cotahuasi Canyon in Peru that were crucial to the chronology in my recent book, and to integrate better the colonial worlds of Spanish America and Brazil, and between Latin America and Europe, which is a field that's still not being explored as it could be. I wrote my book, Andean Hybrid Baroque, specifically to address some of these issues. The photographic surveys and archival research I undertook in Peru, Bolivia, and Argentina allowed me to adjust and validate existing chronologies, to highlight regional variations that were brought about by this style spread over a very wide expanse, the size of France and Spain put together. And to discover even more names and even more ethnicities, because these were very frequently recorded in the documents of Native American craftsmen. And to focus on the often innovative ways that buildings and their ornamentation responded to the needs and faiths of their communities. But this book is a contribution to only one aspect of colonial architecture, a very limited one, in which indigenous acculturation is most visible. What is imperative now is that we look beyond works that exhibit Native American acculturation toward the rich Criollo, Mestizo, Asian, and African American contributions that await us in the cities and towns, away from these tiny villages and mission stations that we've been focusing on for so long, and seek a more balanced view of vice-regal art and architecture in all of its magnitude and all of its complexity. Thank you.